Enlivened and engaged, Ignatius studied the core of his beliefs. He examined how intellect and feelings worked in his life.
Ignatius started writing some things down, and it were kind of notes that he was making about his own spiritual experiences. And these are really the kind of the nucleus of what later would become spiritual exercises, all kinds of prayer, meditation, contemplation for the growth of the soul. And really it's a little manual in some ways for ego reduction. For realizing that I'm not the center of the universe, that God is the center of the universe. And in a way, what it does is attempt to replicate the experience that Ignatius had. Ignatius sets out rules for discernment. How can I make a choice? What are the techniques? How can I know God's will? Now, God's will doesn't come like a fax. So we have to really examine ourselves. And in this way that Ignatius constantly examined himself and trying to find out what are the ways in which God might be guiding me in my life. And that's really the kind of fundamental idea of the spiritual exercises, is to put one's life in sync with the will of God. What Ignatius is trying to do is to find a kind of a way in which we don't despise the world, but that we actually go around looking for the traces of God in all things. I think the closest parallel I can think about this is being in love. When you're desperately in love with somebody, you see them everywhere. Everything that you go through reminds you of them. And I think that's what we mean about finding God in all things, that somehow God is never absent from all human experience. This is not a spirituality which is just for monks or just for nuns. It's not a spirituality just for priests. There are practical things which can be applied and adapted to people who live normal, usual lives. Ignatius assumes that the people are good. And so the choice in the exercises is not between good and evil. The choice is between good and better. And that, I think, is at the heart of the exercises.
Enthused with spiritual vigor, Ignatius hastened to spread his message to the world.
Now, to claim that you are having special spiritual experiences in 16th century Spain is a little bit scary. It's potentially difficult because this is the time of the Inquisition. The Church is deeply worried about new currents of thought coming in, particularly ones which are claiming that somehow the Church and everything that it involves might be somehow secondary. Ignatius has a little brush in with the Inquisition because he's teaching people. He's leading them through the spiritual exercises. But first of all, he's not a priest at this point, and he hasn't had any particular theological education. So the Inquisition wants to know, excuse me, where does this come from? Are you doing this by yourself? What's the connection with the local church? Ignatius boldly takes on the Inquisition in many ways. When he explains what the spiritual exercises are, they allow him to carry on. But they advise him quite strongly that he needs to get some theological education. And he does. And this is a man who's 30, military commander, and then he has to go back to school. And he finds himself in school with kids. Just try and imagine what an act of humility that is, to find yourself in school, reduced to the level of a child again. And he studies, first of all, in Alcalá, which is an ancient university just outside Madrid. He wasn't there very long in Alcalá, and he goes to the prime university, which is the University of Paris. So he has to find his way, and he walks all the way from Alcalá to Paris. And turns up in Paris with a mule loaded with books, some money which a kind lady in Barcelona has given him, and it's not very much, and he sets himself to study. It's not an easy life. So Ignatius is in Paris. He has to follow the typical course of studies, which involves philosophy, involves Latin, rhetoric, several different branches of the classical studies. And he's put to room in a not very nice place with two other people who really don't want him there. One of them is a kind of pious, a little too intense man called Peter Favor from Savoy, which is on the edge of France and Italy. And the other one is a Basque, Francisco Javier. There's clearly something about Ignatius' personality which was deeply magnetic and attractive. Over a period of time, Ignatius groups around him a group of 6 friends, 6 companions. These are men who are have the same kind of understanding of life, the same concerns, the same things that delight them and worry them, and they form an informal group. but they decide they actually want to stay together. What they are called to be, what they want to do, they're not quite sure. But the idea is that they want to be together with Jesus in some way. And this later will form the nucleus of what we now call the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. In Montmartre, a church in Paris, they take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And their desire is to remain together. They hope to go to the Holy Land. But if that is not going to work out, then their intention is to go back to Rome and to offer themselves to the Pope for the service in whatever way he needs them. So it's not exactly clear what they want to do. They themselves don't have a clear idea, but they use this phrase, helping souls, means helping people. But what they're proposing is a kind of a new way of living within the church. They don't want to be monks. They don't want to live in a monastery. They want to be out in the world, engaged with the world.
They formed a group bound by their intimate experience of the living Christ, and these first Jesuits would withstand the forces of time, distance, and separation.
Ignatius goes back to his family in Spain, and they go ahead of him to Venice, which is going to be the port where they intend to go to the Holy Land from, to await Ignatius. Ignatius joins them in Venice. They're there for a whole year. They start working, and where they work is in hospitals, doing the most menial chores. They're also preaching publicly and teaching catechism to kids. But enough is enough. After a year, very practically, they decide, okay, well, plan A hasn't worked. We have to do plan B, which is to get their way to Rome. On his way to Rome, Ignatius has a vision in which he sees himself being placed with Jesus. And he interprets this as meaning things are going to go okay in Rome. What they want is permission from the Pope, Pope Paul III,